You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Wednesday evening, folks. Let's get on with this. I welcome you back to my show. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on Odyssey Radio Network. And you can find the audio stream over at odysy1.com. And while over there, you can find all the links to iTunes, to iHeartRadio, to Spreaker, to all the other Podbean, everything else that we're broadcast on, as well as some terrestrial stations around the nation. And then come on over and see the simulcast video over on my YouTube channel. That's Mr. Scotty Roberts. And you can join the live chat room, get into a lively discussion and a debate, or find, as some people like to do in the chat room, get off on totally different tangents and talk about things. But come on over. Join the crowd live. And I want to thank you all for being here. I don't know why I stumble and stammer over that. I say the same thing every day. So, thanks for coming by. And let's get on with it here. We've been talking about Jesus. We've been talking about... The reason I think this is important is because we've been talking about the comparatives between what we have been taught in Western culture, Western Christianity about Jesus, and how it compares to all these ancient God-man types that came before him. And this seems to lay out an anthropological picture to me. And we're going to still go on with the comparison tonight so you can see how all these different things compare. And then we're going to hit why some of those things have a different point of view to them. Maybe the historical Jesus is what we were taught he was. We'll get there eventually. But for now, we're going to cover this. I think it's important because, anthropologically speaking, it shows that maybe all religion comes from the same place. It comes from within us. It's things that we build. It's things that we attribute to our leaders or to our the heads of our various religions and denominations. Maybe that says to us that everybody is the same, that we all have, as some would say on a spiritual level, that we are all gods, that we all have that spark of divinity in us. Those were all things that I said I would never believe that was as far out there as you could get from Christian theology, back when I was steeped in Christian theology. And yet now, it seems to be what is almost obvious. So it comes down to this for me, and ask yourself this question as you look at these things. Either one side of this is, it's all the same. There is no Jesus God, there is no Catholic God, there is no denominational God that has a corner on theology. The ancient religions, Islam, Judaism, it's all really the same when you get down to the core. Everything about those religions and those denominations within those religions, the sects within the religions, all have to do with what we do as people to make them fit what we want it to be. And so the big question is, and we used to ask this from the other way around when I was in my seminary days and my ministry days, are we making Jesus to be what we want him to be rather than what he is? And did his followers do the same thing in the early centuries after his lifetime? And yes, I do believe he was an historical character, but there's scant evidence about him, I believe, because there wasn't much known about him at the time he existed. Itinerant, preaching, healing rabbi of the time. He was not a worldwide religion when he was alive. His followers over the following centuries made him so. And it's what they added to him is the question at hand. So there, I've kind of spread that out there, and I've said this almost every day, but this is really my purpose and intent for going through this. Is there an alternative to what we were told was so? And if that alternative is true, what does that do to what we were told was so? What does that do to the divinity of Jesus? Does that mean he is not divine? Does it mean he is just another one of these mystery God-men that is out there? He is one of many, one of the elevated masters, as some would put it. Is he the one and only, to the exclusion of all else, even though his story matches the stories of so many others that came before him? And we all know the message of Jesus is a little different. It's a little different in that he was the one who came to shed his blood in a religion that required blood as a sacrifice. And he was the one that was the Lamb of God, the lamb being the symbol of the lamb that was brought to the temple and sacrificed once a year for the sins of the people, to atone for the sins of the people. And then it was supposed to be Jesus, the Messiah, the kinsman redeemer, the one who was one of us redeemer that was prophesied, that was supposed to be the one to accomplish this end. So there's the big questions. So by looking at this material, are we stepping into satanic territory? This is deceptions from the evil side of the universe? Or is this information that we can garner to say, maybe there's more to or less to what we thought we believed? That's why I'm doing this, and that's why I think we should continue looking at this and continue moving forward and dissecting these things a little bit. Yesterday, we talked about the baptism thing. And so we're going to move on to that. Now, I want to talk about the miracles of Jesus and the miracles of the God-men who came before him. Now, if you missed it, by the way, let's redefine for just a few moments what the God-man was. In Jesus' context, the God-man was God, very God, creator of the universe, emptying himself of all that he was, coming down in the form of an infant, being born of a woman that he impregnated. If that's not a confusing enough story, you get the idea. Supposedly, he had the ability to do all of this, and that child was born, and that child was 100% God and 100% human. It was like not even a blending or a mixing. It was the absolute 100% of both, contained in one, the defying of physics, if you will, of biology, of all of that, of spirituality. So this is who the God-man was. He was God in the form of man, come to be one of us. Remember the prophesied kinsman redeemer, the one who would be one of us redeemer. And so that's the God-man. And then you have in the ancient pagan mysteries and religion, you had all these other God-men that were among us. They were God, born of virgin births, born to come to the earth, not necessarily to save the earth, but to deliver messages of goodness, of rightness, of God messages in the form of God-men. That's putting it in very simplistic terms for this. So, this God-man had the ability in Jesus to perform miracles. These were the things that really demonstrated. I don't know that he went out there and said, at 1:15 p.m. today, on the 17th of Shavat, we're going to perform miracles so you can see that I'm God. I don't think that was it. I think he just had the ability, and he was able to, at least according to the story that we're told, harness the power of the universe to do certain things. Now, we call that, in modern tradition, we call that magic. That there are, I know when I read tarot cards, there's the card of the magician. And the magician, I've always used the example of Jesus when describing what the magician does. The magician is able to look at all the things around him in the natural world and pull and pluck the things that he needs to create the magic to perform the miracle or the spell or whatever it is he needs to do. And I think that Jesus did this. If you look at his miracles, a lot of them involved natural deeds and natural happenstances. And so let's look at these miracles. The early Egyptian Christian Basilides believed that Jesus was baptized on January 6th, a date which has been celebrated in centuries in Egypt as the day of Osiris. Some Christians commemorated this date as the day on which Christ sanctified the water. They offered prayers at midnight on the 5th of January. Then all rushed with pitchers to a river to obtain water which was believed now to be holy and possess the purifying powers. For hundreds of years before the time of Christ, Egyptians had been doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time, the 6th of January and the night before, the 5th of January. And the 6th, of course, is when we celebrate Eastern Orthodox Christianity, or Christmas, And so the night of January 5th was said to be a time when the waters of the Nile gained miracle-working powers. And it was through the grace of Osiris in Egyptian religion. Now, these waters were drawn in pitchers by the Egyptians. They were kept in their houses as a defense against evil. These mystical, miraculous, miracle-working powers of the water the night before. And so the night of January 5th was also the time when Dionysus was believed to miraculously change. He changed water into wine. Water into wine. Dionysus did this. Remember the story of Jesus, his first miracle of his ministry? The wedding at Cana, where he changes water into wine. Dionysus did this prior to the time of Christ. And according to Pliny, on the island of Andros, a stream of wine flowed into the temple of Dionysus and continued for 7 days. But if samples of it were taken out of the sanctuary, they immediately turned to water. We also hear that on Naxos, a spring miraculously issued forth fragrant wine. And during the Greek festival called Thaia, 3 empty basins were put into a room. In the presence of citizens and foreigners, the room was then locked and sealed, and anyone who wanted could bring his own seal to add to the seal on the door. And on the next day, the seals remained unbroken, but those entering the room found that the 3 basins had miraculously been filled with wine. Now, the first thing that comes into my mind is knowing that in places like the Temple of Philo, I think it is, there was an echo chamber behind the altar. You can go visit that today. You can go walk behind what was the altar in the temple there. And the priests would talk there, and they would issue decrees and edicts, not edicts, it's not the word, spiritual edicts from back there. And the people thought it was the voice of the gods whispering and talking, when in actuality it was the priests behind the wall doing this. And you can go visit that location today and walk back there and see where that was. Now, were the people really fooled by that, or did they just accept that? Yeah, we know it's a priest back there, but that's the voice of God speaking to us through the priest. And we don't see the priest, we hear the whispering, echoing voices. Now, is this what people accepted back in that day? Was it easier to do sleight of hand back then when we didn't have the technology to decipher it all? So, anyway, Pausanias assures us that citizens and foreigners alike vouched under oath for the reliability of this report, where they sealed up the room and the empty pitchers then were filled with wine. Now, trickery or not, this was the report. Now, and even back then, they were doing we're going to get all kinds of people to testify to this, to put their own seal on the door, to lock it all up, and the next morning open it up with the unbroken seals and find out that all the pitchers were filled with wine. And we're going to get all these people lined up. So there was a skepticism at play even back then, and ways to try to either debunk it or prove it so. So according to myth, the miracle of turning water into wine took place for the first time at the marriage of Dionysus and Ariadne. Ariadne. That's it backwards. I keep wanting to say Adrian, but that's a dyslexic way of looking at the name. Ariadne. Ariadne. And the same miracle is attributed to Jesus at the wedding feast in Cana. In the 4th century of the Common Era, A.D., Saint Epiphanes relates similar miracles still happening on January 6th and claims to have drunk of a spring that had issued forth wine. But he no longer attributes the miracles to Dionysus, but to Jesus. And for Epiphanius, such miracles now occurred at the hour when Jesus ordered the water to be taken to the master of the feast, and he changed their water into wine. So that was the new contention by Epiphanius. And I want to see if there's some good information of where to look up more about this. Now, it's Leitzman. You can go look at his books. I don't even have that list. I don't have a bibliography for my radio shows, so that's pointless for you. But other of Jesus' miracle. Wait, I want to stay on that for a second before I get to the other kinds of miracles. The turning of the water into wine. That took place at the wedding of Cana, but it originally took place at the wedding feast of Dionysus, hundreds of years earlier. And so this gives you an idea of how a story may have been adapted to the life of Jesus, to the deeds of Jesus and the miracles of Jesus. I had always said about the wedding at Cana, Jesus' first public ministry miracle, was that this was something that Jesus, I believe, it was his wedding. Now, the Bible does not say it was his wedding, but there seem to be several things within the text and within historical tradition that lead to that. We've talked about this before in other contexts of different things I've talked about over the year. But let's cover it for just a second. You look at Jesus. In Jewish tradition, as even before the time of Jesus, to now today, the groom's family at a wedding is always responsible for the wine at the wedding. So what's the first thing we notice about the wedding at Cana? Jesus' mom comes to Jesus and says, "Oh my God, we're out of wine." And the first question I asked with that was, why is Jesus' mom coming to Jesus to tell him we're out of wine? And something that's sometimes overlooked, she obviously has a position of responsibility at this wedding because she's the one who brings the news to Jesus. Now, she brings it to him. Why? Does she know he has the ability to perform miracles? Has he performed any other recorded miracles prior to this in the biblical story? No. Now, there's traditional stories, he turned dust balls into birds and things like that when he was a kid or something like that. But those are all traditional stories. When you go to the scripture itself, in the gospel, there's no other recorded miracles of Jesus prior to this. But she goes to him. We're out of wine. Why does she go to him? Probably because he's the groom. And she's saying, "Oh my God, we're out of wine. What are we going to do? Are you going to go? Can you send somebody to get wine? What can we do?" And what does Jesus say? He says, "Woman, settle down. I've got it." That's what he says to his mom. "Mom, woman, settle down." Now, is that a traditional way of speak? Or was it "Oh my God, woman, chill. I got this taken care of, ma." And what does he do? He has authority over the servants to go fetch water. And they go fetch the water, bring it back, and they dip into it, and it's, of course, the finest wine ever that anyone has ever tasted. So he changes the water into wine. And he has authority over the servants to make him do this. If you're at a wedding and you say to somebody, "Hey, go fetch a bunch of pitchers of wine, of water for me," they look at you and they go, "You're not my boss." So he had some authority there, so did his mother. And there's several other things in that account that seem to show that it was Jesus' wedding. This is the first miracle of his ministry. And a rabbi was not considered to be worth his salt unless he was a married man. This is the first miracle of Jesus' ministry, public ministry, and it's at a wedding, which was probably his wedding. And so there's many things you can look through for this. But the comparative is interesting, is that the water was turned to wine at the wedding of Dionysus as well, sometime earlier. And so the same miracles attributed to Jesus. Other of Jesus' miracles were also attributed to the pagan god-man Asclepius. I'm sorry for the way that sounds. Asclepius. Asclepius. There you go. So, Asclepius. Thanks, Mom and Dad. Thanks for the name. Who was followed by Hippocrates, the father of medicine, was said the Hippocratic Oath, all came from him and all of that. So Asclepius, followed by Hippocrates, the father of medicine, was said to have cured the sick and raised the dead. He was known as the lover of men. A comparison between the wonders of Asclepius and the miracles of Jesus was a standard feature of pagan anti-Christian writings. In reply, early Christians described Jesus as the physician greater than the great Asclepius, and pagan Celsus and the Christian Origen argued with equal conviction as to the relative merits of Asclepius, the Savior, or Jesus, the Savior. That was actually a schism, I don't know if it would be a schism. It didn't break anybody up. It was a controversy of the times right after Jesus. Is Jesus the Savior, or is Asclepius the Savior? So many of the inscriptions to Asclepius were taken over by early Christians by simply replacing his name with that of Jesus. And you can find out some information on that. The statues of Asclepius became models for the 4th and 5th century depictions of Jesus. And you can go look some of that up. Asclepius, again. Go look him up. Asclepius. Asclepius. Depends on if your I is long or short, I suppose. To the ass of your pious. So, many of the great prophets of Osiris Dionysus were renowned as these wandering wonder workers, miracle givers, who performed exactly the same supernatural feats attributed to the wandering wonder worker Jesus of Nazareth. Pythagoras was particularly famous for his miracles. Like Jesus, he was said to have performed many healings, and as he went around from town to town, the word got out about that he was coming, and to not teach, but to heal. So, look, we got a break right there in the middle of a thought because we're at the end of the first segment. Sit tight for 2 minutes. We'll be right back. All right, folks, welcome back. Thanks for sitting through the break. This is Scotty Roberts with the Intrepid Radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And go over to odyssey1.com, ODYSY1.com to listen to the audio stream. Or you can come on over, or at the same time, come over and view the simulcast video over on my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts. And join the live chat room there. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to my channel, and you can get all the radio shows we've put up since I started on Odyssey and for a year before that. So come on over, join the channel, subscribe to it, watch the videos there. We left off on an interesting spot where I want to recap this. I generally don't like to carry the same exact thought over a break. So let's do that anyway, though, because I was talking about how many of the prophets of Osiris, Dionysus, were renowned as these wandering miracle workers. They were wonder workers. Remember Jesus, even at the time of Jesus, there were times where the crowds would follow him. And there were times where, pardon my cough and my lack of cough button, once again. So, the crowds were sometimes where Jesus needed to rest, and he was just like, send them home. I can't do this. And there were times he tried to sneak into towns so people wouldn't know he was there. Because, especially in those days, when everybody found out that Jesus was a miracle worker, somebody who could cure illnesses, raise the dead, all of these things, do you think for a moment that he had any peace when he entered these towns? Was that his... and I don't use this word in a negative way, even though it's a negative word. Was that his gimmick? Was that what he used to be able to draw people? Was that the extroverted information that drew people to him, and then he could reveal to them the esoteric, not extroverted, exoteric, I'm sorry. Was that the exoteric information that drew the crowds in, made them ask questions, and then he was able to sit them all down and say, here's the esoteric, the inner mysteries. This is what Jesus did. So, like Jesus, there was Pythagoras, amongst many others, who performed miracles. He was said to have performed many healings, and as he went around from town to town, the word got out that he was coming, not to teach, but to heal. In his life of Pythagoras, Iamblichus claims that Pythagoras' innumerable miracles included tranquilizations, tranquilizations of the waves of rivers and seas in order that his disciples might the more easily pass over them. So he's saying Pythagoras caused the waters to still so people could cross them without danger to themselves. According to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus performs the same miracle to benefit his disciples on the Sea of Galilee. And this miracle was clearly part of the legendary biographies of the many pagan wonder workers, for Iamblichus adds, he says this, the power of effecting miracles of this kind was achieved by Empedocles of Agrigentum, Epimenides the Cretan, and Abaris the Hyperborean, and these they performed in many places. So this is what Iamblichus said of all these miracles comparing to Jesus. And so when you look at this, remember what Jesus did that was like the calming of the waters, supposedly, which Pythagoras did to make it safe for his people to come and visit him. Jesus was out on the sea and with the disciples, and it says a great storm rises up. And the disciples are thinking they're going to sink. And where's Jesus? Jesus is sleeping in the bow of the ship, covered up by something. And they have to go wake him up. And they say to him, Master, don't you care that we're all going to drown? We'll all perish here tonight? And Jesus is like, bitch, calm down. I could just hear it in vernacular. Of course, if Jesus is God and all that, he's not going to talk that way. But that's almost the reaction you'd see. Here's the guy who knows he's God and has the power. Say, bitch, calm down. I got this. And he stands up and it says he calms the storm, poof, like glass. And the disciples said, well, this is the Son of God, obviously. And so, in the Gospel of John, Jesus miraculously helps his disciples land a large cachet of fish. You remember that? They're fishing all night long, and they got nothing. And Jesus from the shore goes, hey, Peter! And Peter's like, what? I'm frustrated. I've been fishing all night. I got nothing. Jesus said, throw your net off the other side of the boat. And you can imagine Peter, a seasoned fisherman by trade, is probably like, did he go, oh, yes, master, I will do what you say. No, I think he probably went, oh, okay, other side of the boat. I'm doing this for you. But the supernatural feat was also performed. Oh, and by the way, the upcatch to that story is that they cast the net on the other side of the boat and had so much they thought they were going to sink the boat with it. So this supernatural feat was also performed by Pythagoras in a legend recorded by Porphyry. So I've got all these names written down, but do I pronounce them all every day? No. Porphyry. 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 Okay? This is a report recorded by Porphyry about Pythagoras. And Pythagoras miraculously predicted the exact number of fish that would be caught. But the story does not record what this number was. In the gospel account, Jesus makes no such prediction, but we're told that the catch number is exactly 153 fish. This seems on the face to be an irrelevant fact that the gospel writer included just for dramatic color, but scholars have concluded that it is mentioned deliberately, and it's highly significant, the number of 150. It's likely that the number of fish that Pythagoras predicted would be caught was precisely 153. The Pythagoreans were renowned for their knowledge of mathematics and regarded 153 as a sacred number. And it's used in a mathematical ratio, which Archimedes called the measure of the fish. It was this big. The measure of the fish to produce the mystical symbol of the Vesica, Pisces, or the sign of the fish. And the intersection of the two circles, which yields a fish-like shape, this was an ancient Pythagorean symbol that was used by early Christians to represent their faith. The conflux of the two circles. And it became a fish. And this yields a fish-like shape. And the fact that this mystical fish symbol can be produced from the number of fish that were caught in the account of Jesus' miracle strongly suggests it's been adapted from the original miracle of Pythagoras, and that this miracle story encoded sacred geometrical formula. Now, is that a lot to swallow? Is that a lot to speculate on? Is there a speculation? Do you think that Pythagoras' 153, which was not named in the account by Pythagoras, is exactly the same number that it is said the disciples caught on that day Jesus told them to cast a net? No, there is nothing to prove that those two numbers were the same. However, all the uses and the overlaps start to look like this 153 was probably the same number that Pythagoras used. And it created this melding of the two circles together to create the fish in the middle. And so it's interesting stuff, folks. These comparisons go on like this, and these are the kinds of comparisons you can look at to say there are comparatives out there. So why would the story of Jesus telling the disciples where to cast the net to get a number of fish, why would that number then match the Pythagorean theory of the measure for fish, and also for the perfect number for melding the two faiths, or the two elements of faith. So it's a very interesting thing to look at. The sign of the fish is widely used today as a symbol of Christianity, but it originated in pagan sacred geometry. The two circles, symbolic of spirit and matter, are brought together in a sacred marriage. And when the circumference of the one touches the center of the other, they combine to produce the fish shape in the middle with the back fins that come off. And they combine this fish shape known as the, and I can never say this, the vesica piscis. The ratio of height to length of this shape is 153 to 265. It's a formula known to Archimedes in the 3rd century BCE as the measure of the fish. It's a powerful mathematical tool, being the nearest whole number approximation of the square root of 3 and the controlling ratio of the equilateral triangle. So you get the sign of the fish with the two intersecting circles of faith and spirit. Spirit and matter. So Pythagoras' disciple, Empedocles, was another wandering wonder miracle worker. Like Pythagoras, like Jesus, he was a self-proclaimed God-man, announcing himself to the people of Acragas as an immortal god, no longer immortal. How would you feel about somebody? You said, "By the way, folks, I need to make an announcement. You all know me, but I am no longer a mortal man. I am an immortal god." What would you think of that person? Well, this is what he did. But people followed him in droves, not because he said the words, but because he seemed to be able to perform the deeds to back it up. And they followed him in droves. They adorned him with ribbons and asked for miracles. And like Jesus, he was said to have knowledge of the future. So he was a prognosticator, not a fortune teller. That's a little different. He was somebody who seemed to know the future. Like Jesus, he taught spiritual truths and he cured sicknesses. He was known as the wind stiller. And like Jesus, had the ability to control the wind and the rain. He assured his disciples that as a result of what he would teach them, they would also be able to fetch from the underworld the life force of a man who had died. Empedocles himself was said to have raised back to life a woman who had been dead for 30 days, just as Jesus was said to have raised Lazarus 500 years later. Not Lazarus being 500 years dead. 500 years after the time of Empedocles, raising a woman from the dead after 30 days, Jesus did the same thing with Lazarus. Now, Apollonius of Tyana was another wandering god-man who healed the sick. He predicted the future. He raised the dead. And although not physically present, he was said to have brought back to life the daughter of a Roman consul, in exactly the same way as Jesus is said to have brought back to life the daughter of Jairus, the centurion, a president of the synagogue without even visiting her. Wait, Jairus was not the Roman, but a member of the synagogue. And Jairus' daughter, remember, he used those words, I think they were Talitha Kumi in Aramaic. And I don't even remember exactly what those mean, but he raised her from the dead. And now, was she in a coma? Was she passed out? We don't know exactly. We know what the story tells us. The story says Jesus raised her from the dead. And this is exactly what Apollonius of Tyana was supposed to have done as well. Both, one was a Roman official, one was a member of the Sanhedrin. Like Jesus, Apollonius also exorcised evil spirits. He even describes witnessing a feeding miracle witnessing a feeding miracle similar to Jesus, feeding of the 5,000. Remember when Jesus broke the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes and spread it out to 5,000 people? This was a supernatural feat, which Celsus tells us is an illusion performed by many holy men. Yet, like Jesus, who claims that a prophet is never recognized in his own country, the divine men of pagan legends are commonly represented as rejected by their homeland. Apollonius, I keep wanting to put the emphasis in the wrong place on his name, Apollonius of Tyana writes in a letter, quote, "What wonder is it if, while other men consider me equal to God, my native place so far ignores me?" That's a good question, isn't it? Well, they ignored Jesus too. Remember, members of his own hometown in Nazareth were going to stone him to death. And he slipped out through the crowd. Jesus did. So the Gospels tell us that on one occasion, Jesus exorcised a man of demons who called themselves Legion, because there were about 2,000 of them in the 2 demoniacs of the Gadarenes, if you remember that story. There's an interesting, if you want to look up Szymka Jakubowici, I know, hard to look him up, but look up the naked archaeologist, Szymka Jakubowici. He did a little documentary on all sorts of things, episodic, but he's got a video out there on the demoniac of the Gadarenes, trying to find where the Gadarenes was, and some very interesting stuff on that. There were even some great songs within Christianity. There was one that I would sing with my youth group. It's called "Man of the Tombs," and it was a man of speaking of the maniac or the demoniac of the Gadarenes that Jesus healed, and "Man of the Tombs I am," and so there was a lot of information about that story as a story within the life and the miracles of Jesus. So these demons are cast out by Jesus into a large herd of pigs, which rush over the edge of a hillside and are drowned. So this has to be on a place where there's a great body of water. So this is saying that it's probably right on the beaches of Lake Gethsemane. Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. The big freshwater lake, and in Israel. And so that comes into play in trying to locate the exact place where there was a cemetery, an ancient cemetery, where there was a hillside that was nearby that the pigs could run into and run off the edge and die in the water below. Hard to find and locate a geographic location like that in Israel. That's another story. So exactly the same motif is found in the rites of the mysteries at Eleusis. As part of the purification ceremony, before initiation, some 2,000 initiates, all bathed in the sea with young pigs. This bathing ritual banishing all evil into the pigs, which were then sacrificed, as a symbol of the initiate's own impurities, by being chased over a chasm. Is that interesting to you? That ceremony looks so much like the casting out of Legion, out of the demoniacs of the Gadarenes into the pigs who run over the edge of the cliff and kill themselves in the water. Even the Pentecostal miracle of speaking in tongues is prefigured by pagan myth. Pardon me, I still am just getting over this cold. I'm a lot better today. Got a couple of coughs in there, so pardon me for that. So even the Pentecostal miracle of speaking in tongues, if none of you know what that is, it's an interesting thing to watch. Speaking in tongues, it's where people in gatherings would break out into languages that nobody could interpret. And they were supposedly speaking in the tongues of angels. That happens in the Pentecostal church. You know, whatever it is it sounds like. Not mocking those that do it for real. But it's supposed to be something where the Spirit takes over and does this. It's almost like an ecstatic type of a miracle. But then Paul in the New Testament writes, if you're going to speak in tongues, you better have an interpreter. If you don't have an interpreter, what good is it to the people? And therefore it doesn't mean anything. It's gibberish. So they had, in Pentecostalism, you got the speaking of tongues. And it's also prefigured in pagan myth. After Jesus' death, the disciples found themselves miraculously speaking in strange tongues on the day of Pentecost, and which others heard in their own native languages. So in this big gathering, they all start preaching the gospel of Jesus after the ascension of Jesus, the day of Pentecost. And it says, little cloven tongues of fire appeared over their heads when the Spirit entered them. And they all started speaking in what seemed like gibberish to everyone else, but everyone who was gathered heard it in their own languages. So this was a miraculous event. And the same phenomenon was reported centuries earlier at Trophonius and Delos, where the oracular priestesses seemed to some to speak unintelligibly, while other witnesses heard them speaking in all their different languages. This was the report, their mother tongues. Burkert, one of the most foremost modern classical scholars, asserts that these pagans and these Christian miracles have justly been compared, that it's really the same kind of thing going on in this miracle. And Christians asserted that Jesus' claim to being the one and only Son of God was proven by his miracles. To Celsus, this was plainly ridiculous. He tells us, quote, miracles and wonders have indeed occurred everywhere and in all times. And he lists a number of pagan sages and godmen who were renowned as wonder workers and miracle makers. And the standard Christian response to such pagan critics? It was to claim that whilst Jesus' miracles were a sign of his divinity, pagan miracles were the works of the devil. And Celsus replies indignantly to this. He says, good Lord, he says, is it not a silly sort of argument to reckon by the same works that one man is a god, whilst his rivals are mere sorcerers? And when you look at that, it can only be someone who hangs their faith on one certain hook will denounce the other faith for doing the same things as being demonic and outside the faith. So the ancient godmen could do some of the same things that Jesus did, while Jesus, with him, it was a proof that he was the Son of God, and with these ancient godmen, it was a proof that they were of Satan. Again, back to the whole diabolical mimicry issue. So you can see by the miracles that there were things that were across the board that worked for everybody. And by looking at some of these things, now we can't prove the veracity of the miracle. There is no way to test that. There is no scientific methodology by which you can find out if that was a true thing that happened, an actual thing that happened. We can't do it. But what we can do is compare the accounts. There were accounts of these ancient guys, accounts of Jesus, that they could all do the same types of things. Yet one is claimed to be the very God of the universe, while the others are claimed to be products of diabolical mimicry of Satan, at least by the Christian followers who declared Jesus was the one and only. And so the question that would have to be posed to you is, are these likenesses proof that Jesus and the story of Jesus, the accounts of his miracles, the accounts of his deeds, when they cross over with those that came before him, many other figures who came before him in the pagan mysteries, the other god men, does that make Jesus one of them? What makes him stand out? Why does he get the accolades and the others don't? It's because his followers made that so. It was his followers who wanted future followers or future people who would come to ask the questions. This is what they wanted them to know. So it comes back down to the next question. And before I get into talking about the God-man and his disciples, which we're going to do next time, because within about a minute we're out of time here. But the big question, once again, is Jesus God very God? Or is Jesus one of many God-men that points the way exoterically to the esoteric inner mysteries? Gotta ask yourself those questions. And we're going to keep pounding on this as we go on in the near future. Going to go out now for a 23-hour break. And I do hope you sit there and be right back to listen to what we got for you tomorrow night. Stay tuned.